It was a Friday night, and my friends and I were looking forward to our usual bowling night, something we did almost every weekend to unwind after a long week. We didn't always go to the same alley, but we had a few local spots that we liked. This particular night, we decided to visit an alley we hadn't been to in a while. It was an older place, but it had that nostalgic charm to it, kind of like stepping back in time with its neon carpeting, outdated arcade machines, and the familiar clatter of pins in the background. It wasn't the fanciest place by any stretch, but it was cheap and always had lanes available, which worked for us. When we arrived, I noticed right away that the crowd was a bit different than what we were used to. The usual families and groups of friends were there, but mixed in were a few sketchy-looking guys lingering by the bar. It wasn't anything that alarmed us at first, just the kind of crowd you sometimes see at these older bowling alleys. My friends Jake and Nick were already a few beers in by the time I showed up, so they were relaxed and ready to play. We grabbed our lane, ordered some drinks, and settled into the game, making our usual jokes about who would dominate the night. Everything felt normal enough, at least for a little while. A few frames in, I started to notice that the atmosphere was changing. It wasn't just the usual background noise of pins falling and people talking. It was more tense. The guys at the bar were getting louder, and their conversations had a sharp edge to them, the kind of tone that puts you on alert without you even realizing it at first. I tried to focus on the game, but it was hard to ignore what was happening behind us. One of the men, a tall guy with a shaved head and a leather jacket, had started pacing back and forth near our lane. He wasn't looking at us directly, but you could feel his presence, like he was waiting for something to kick off. Jake noticed it too. "That guy's been walking around for a while now," he muttered, nodding toward the pacing man. I glanced over and caught sight of him as he circled back toward the bar, still not making eye contact but staying close enough to be noticed. The tension in the alley was rising, and I could tell that it wasn't just us who felt it. The families on the other side of the alley seemed to be wrapping up their games faster than usual, and the regular chatter had died down. It was subtle, but people were starting to pay attention to the group at the bar. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I had a bad feeling that something was brewing. Halfway through our second game, things took a turn. We were mid-frame when we heard a loud crash from the bar area. One of the guys had slammed his glass down, shattering it across the counter. Everyone in the alley turned to look, and that's when the shouting started. The tall guy in the leather jacket was yelling at one of the bartenders, his voice raised in anger, but I couldn't make out what he was saying at first. The other guys he'd been sitting with stood up, clearly backing him up. It looked like things were about to get out of hand fast. Nick stood up, trying to get a better view, but I grabbed his arm and pulled him back. "Let's just stay out of it," I said, my voice low. We weren't looking for trouble, and the last thing we needed was to get involved in whatever was happening over there. But staying out of it wasn't going to be an option. The argument at the bar escalated quickly. One of the other men shoved the bartender, and suddenly, there was a full-blown altercation. Bottles were knocked over, chairs scraped across the floor, and I could hear glass shattering as more things were thrown. The entire alley seemed to freeze for a second as people tried to figure out what to do. Some were already heading for the exit, while others just stood there, unsure of whether to watch or leave. My heart was racing, and I could see Jake and Nick were just as rattled. "We should go," Jake said, his voice tense. I nodded in agreement, but before we could grab our things, one of the guys from the bar started walking toward our lane. He wasn't the tall guy. This one was shorter, stockier, but just as angry. His face was flushed red, and he was looking around like he was trying to decide whether to take his frustration out on us or someone else. "Let's go," I said, my voice more urgent now. We grabbed our stuff and started heading toward the exit, trying to act casual, but my pulse was hammering in my ears. As we walked past the guy, he muttered something under his breath, but we didn't stick around to find out what it was. Behind us, the fight was still raging, and I could hear the bartender yelling for someone to call the police. Once we got outside, the night air hit us, and we all let out a breath we hadn't realized we'd been holding. "That was crazy," Nick said, shaking his head. Jake was already on his phone, calling an Uber to get us out of there as fast as possible. We stood by the entrance, watching as a few more people trickled out of the alley, looking shaken. I glanced back inside, just in time to see one of the guys from the fight being dragged out by a couple of his friends, still cursing and struggling to break free. The whole thing had escalated so fast that it almost didn't feel real. I'd never seen a night at the alley go sideways like that before. We didn't stick around to see how it ended. Our Uber pulled up, and we piled in, the adrenaline still pumping through our veins. "We're never going back there," Jake said, his voice firm. We all agreed. What had started as a normal bowling night had turned into something way more dangerous than any of us had expected. The worst part was, it could have easily involved us if we hadn't left when we did. That guy who walked toward us, he was looking for trouble, and if we'd stayed even a minute longer, who knows what could have happened. I didn't like thinking about it, but the whole situation had left us all rattled. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of the fight. I kept thinking about how quickly things had escalated, and how close we'd come to getting caught in the middle of it. I checked the local news, half expecting to see something about the fight at the alley, but there was nothing. Maybe the police had come and broken it up before it got out of hand, or maybe it was just another night at a rundown bowling alley where things went wrong. Either way, we weren't going back. The incident left a mark on all of us, a reminder that sometimes a place you've been to dozens of times can turn dangerous without warning. It's been a while since that night, but I still think about it whenever we talk about going bowling. We've found other places to go since then, but that alley is off limits for good. What was supposed to be a fun, laid-back night out with friends turned into something none of us expected. A situation where we were lucky to get out without getting caught up in the chaos. It made me realize that even in familiar places, things can take a dark turn when you least expect it. Now, whenever we go out, I'm more aware of my surroundings, keeping an eye out for anything that feels off. It's a habit I picked up that night, and it's one I don't plan on letting go anytime soon.